Here's a guy who uses a bunch of fallacious arguments to accuse folks who believe in evolution of making fallacious arguments.
Have you ever tried climbing a staircase with broken stairs? Hopefully not, because it's impossible. The same thing goes with climbing an argument with unsound or broken steps. It may look like it can be used safely, but once it's put into practice, it collapses. The logic is not able to hold up to scrutiny. We continue our look at logical fallacies and how to spot them. Specifically, do the arguments for evolution have sound stairs to climb? I've heard a lot of people say, well, scientists say that the Earth is however millions of years old, or scientists say that the universe is this many billions of years old. They say that, and I'm just going to trust them. You're not smarter than the scientists. I'm not smarter than the scientists. I'm just smarter than you because I'm listening to the scientists. What do we say to those people?
That is a fallacy. That's it's called the faulty appeal to authority.
No, it isn't. It's just called the appeal to authority or argument from authority. The reason why it is fallacious is because the mere fact that an authority says something is never proof of its truth. The reason creationists want to make up this new fallacy they call the appeal to faulty authority is because they believe that there is at least one authority whose pronouncements are proof of truth. Obviously, this is God or the Bible. Ironically, making up a new version of the appeal to authority fallacy that doesn't apply to the authorities creationists believe in is an example of the special pleading fallacy.
And the funny thing is, it doesn't work on me because I'm a scientist. And so when scientists say this, I'm like, I don't say that. I'm a scientist.
Saying scientists say X is not the same as saying all scientists say X.
When we talk about stuff or matter or life or energy, do you believe that those things are eternal or that they had a beginning point?
Now here's an example of a fallacy. False dichotomy. I believe that matter and energy are finite in the past, but that's not the same as a beginning point in the sense creationists tend to use the term. Creationists use that term to refer to an event in which matter and energy changed from not existing to existing. Since I don't believe that there was ever a time when neither matter nor energy existed, I don't believe that they had a beginning point in this sense. They have never not existed. I also don't believe they have existed for an infinite amount of time.
I'll leave it up to the scientist.
A lot of times people will say science says.
Sure, yeah.
And then it becomes a reification fallacy because science doesn't say anything. Science is a set of tools. It takes a person to say something.
When I say that science says X, I am not using a reification fallacy. I am not treating science as though it is a person that says things. Rather, I'm using metonymy. Metonymy is a kind of metaphor that refers to something using something else which is associated with it. When I say science says X, I am metonymously saying that the overwhelming preponderance of evidence collected via the scientific method is most consistently and parsimoniously explained by idea X. To uncharitably paint this as a reification fallacy is itself a fallacy, specifically the straw man fallacy.
But a lot of times the reason people will phrase it science says is because it sounds very impressive, right? I mean, it's rhetorically persuasive because we all respect science as a tool. It puts people on the moon, makes computers work, and so on. We respect that, we should. And I respect them if they say scientists say, because they've at least taken a step in the right direction.
But what I mean when I say science says X is not scientists say X. I'm saying X is the idea that is most rigorously supported by the evidence.
But most people don't. They'll say science says because you put a face on it, all of a sudden you got a person who can make mistakes. The appeal to authority is tricky because not all appeals to authority are faulty appeals to authority.
Right.
All deductive appeals to authority are faulty. You cannot deduce that something is true from the fact that an authority said it. You can inductively infer that something is more probably true from the fact that a reputable authority said it, but no appeal to authority can ever prove anything.
I do have a certain degree of respect when a scientist makes a claim about something. Here's my research, and I believe that this rock that we collected from the moon, it's a basalt, and here's my reasons for believing that. Okay, I would accept that.
That wouldn't be an appeal to authority. That would be an appeal to the evidence presented by the authority.
That's not a faulty appeal. A faulty appeal is when you appeal to an expert when they're commenting on something that is either outside of their area of expertise or where they have a noticeable bias that would cause them to draw a wrong conclusion in that area.
That cartoon looks suspiciously like Bill Nye, who did a debate with Ken Ham about creationism. Apparently, this dude thinks that of those two, it's Bill Nye who had the bias and/or lack of expertise in the relevant areas of science.
You'll notice that evolutionists fit both of those criteria, at least in my worldview.
But creationists don't? Creationists start with a pre-commitment to a conclusion. Evolutionists do not. Scientists who believe in evolution post-concluded that it is the most useful explanation of the evidence. Creationists pre-conclude that creationism is true and interpret whatever evidence they find to fit that conclusion rather than the other way around.
First of all, when a scientist talks about what happened billions of years ago, he's not doing science. Because science is about what happens in the present.
No, it isn't. Science is about coming up with ideas about why the observations we make in the present look the way they do, with the aim of being able to predict what future observations will look like. Those ideas can be about currently occurring processes or events which happened in the past. If science were entirely about what happens in the present, then there could be no such thing as forensic science, which is all about scientifically determining what happened at a crime scene in the past. If you find someone's fingerprints and DNA in a house that's been robbed, and you infer that they belong to the perpetrator, are you doing history or are you doing forensic science?
It's about studying the current operation of the universe. When you talk about what happened a long time ago, that's a history question, okay? And so he's already outside of his expertise. He doesn't know what happened billions of years ago any more than anyone else.
Science involves inductive inferences. We infer from the fact that we've never seen the laws of physics be different, that they never have been different. But that's not just the case with respect to the past. We also have to inductively infer that the same laws apply everywhere in the present. In fact, when it comes to cosmology, because other galaxies are millions of light years away, and thus we're seeing what they looked like millions of years ago, we have a better reason to believe that the laws of physics applied to those galaxies millions of years ago than we have to believe that they still apply to them today. Maybe Andromeda has different laws of physics now, and we just can't tell because we can only see how it was behaving 2.5 million years ago. A common creationist argument is that there are two different kinds of science, which they call observational science and historical science. This is not a distinction that is recognized by scientists outside of creationist circles. What happened in the past leaves behind observable evidence in the present. So hypotheses about the past are just as scientifically testable as hypotheses about the present. The evidence left behind in the present can either corroborate or disprove scientific hypotheses and theories about what happened in the past. That's science. If it's true that when you talk about what happened a long time ago, that's a history question, then do you think historians should study dinosaurs instead of scientists? Do you think that dinosaurs can't be studied scientifically?
And so you shouldn't be intimidated by scientists say what happened billions of years ago. Well, they can't even predict the weather 1 year in advance.
I hear this argument from climate change denialists a lot. It seems to be predicated on the assumption that short-term extrapolations must be easier to accurately make than long-term extrapolations, when in reality, the opposite is true. When it comes to any trend affected by many variables, statistical noise can make it far more difficult to make accurate short-term predictions than accurate long-term ones. However, when it comes to calculations based largely on the laws of physics, which long-term cosmological models most often are, we aren't even dealing with something that involves much statistical noise. The laws of physics have been observed to be pretty consistent rather than noisy.
Keep that in mind. And secondly, there's a bias there. Those scientists who believe in billions of years tend to reject the biblical worldview.
A bias is an idea that is preferred or presupposed before beginning an inquiry. Do scientists who believe in billions of years reject the biblical worldview because they went into the field with that preference or presupposition? Or is a rejection of the biblical worldview a post-supposition that is inferred from looking at the evidence? I think it's pretty clear that it's the latter. And if you should take possible bias into account when evaluating the veracity of a particular worldview, don't you think you should do that when evaluating the veracity of creationism? It's pretty clear that creationists have their own biases. Science students are trained to challenge their biases. Creationists are trained to preserve them.
And once you reject creation, you need the billions of years in order to have evolution and so on, in order to try and explain away the creation worldview. So that's what makes it a fallacy.
I suspect that this is projection. I suspect this guy is assuming that scientists who don't believe in creationism take the same epistemic approach that he does. I think he starts with the conclusion and interprets the facts in such a way as to fit that conclusion. So he is assuming that folks who believe that the universe is billions of years old are doing the same thing. He doesn't seem to even consider the possibility that the belief that the universe is billions of years old is something inferred from observation rather than something contrived to fit with a preconceived conclusion.
There's formal fallacies. Now, formal fallacies deal with the structure of an argument. And I would say the most common formal fallacy that occurs in Origen's debate is the fallacy of affirming the consequent. And affirming the consequent has this form: if P, then Q, Q, therefore P. I find even scientists make this mistake, which is kind of interesting to me. So let's say my theory P predicts Q, and I do observe Q, therefore my theory is true.
That would be affirming the consequent if that were an argument that scientists actually make. Ironically, this is another example of the straw man fallacy. Scientists don't say that if evidence corroborates a theory, it is therefore proven to be true. If evidence corroborates a theory or hypothesis, all that means scientifically is that the theory or hypothesis is, at least so far, useful for predicting observation. There are, in fact, scientific models which we know are not, or at least not perfectly, true, but we still use them because they predict observations so consistently that they are useful for all practical purposes we may have. For example, the model of the solar system we use allows us to predict where any planet or comet we know about is going to be on any particular date. This model does not take into account the gravitational influence of the Alpha Centauri star system, despite the fact that such influence exists, because that influence is so small that for any practical human purpose it is negligible. Science doesn't even aim at truth in this sense. It only aims at empirically predictive utility.
Although the observation that your theory made a correct prediction doesn't disprove it, it doesn't prove it either.
Nor does it need to. It just needs to be predictively useful, which, by the way, evolution is and creationism is not.
Because there could be other reasons why you've observed that. If it's raining outside, then the grass will be wet. That's true. And you go and you observe, well, the grass is wet. You see, therefore, it must be raining outside. Well, that doesn't necessarily follow, because there could be other causes for why the grass is wet. Maybe somebody left the sprinklers on. Maybe somebody dumped a bucket of water outside. There are other explanations for that.
Yeah, but those other explanations can be tested. Do you even have a sprinkler? If not, that rules out that explanation. Is the grass on other people's lawns also wet? If so, that makes it unlikely that someone dumped water on it, because he would have had to have gone all over the entire neighborhood. And where is he getting all this water, and why has nobody seen him do this? You can check surveillance cameras and look at whether it rained in order to test that hypothesis. There are ways you can evaluate each possible explanation. God is not a useful hypothesis, because how do you test for a God? What could you see that rules God out?
Sometimes evolutionists will do that, and they'll say, well, evolution predicts that we would find a hierarchy in organisms, that we would find that it's possible to organize organisms into a taxonomic tree. Now, that's true. But the fact is, I as a creationist make exactly the same prediction. I would expect that because God has instilled order into his creation, and he's told us to have dominion over the animals. We couldn't do that. If each animal were totally unique, we couldn't classify them, we couldn't study them. And so God has organized organisms into a taxonomy.
But one of those hypotheses is testable and falsifiable, and the other is not. If there were no consistencies between organisms, then I doubt Darwin would ever have been able to infer that evolution ever took place. He would certainly have no basis to infer common ancestry. However, would inconsistencies between organisms prevent the first theists from coming up with the idea of God? I highly doubt it. If God is all-powerful, then he can create whatever he wants, however he wants to create them. You may think God prefers order, but do you think that he is so committed to order as to make it impossible for him to create radically different kinds of organisms instead of taxonomically categorizable ones? If you do, then you don't really believe that God is all-powerful. The biologist J.B.S. Haldane was once asked what would convince him that the theory of evolution is false, and he said that he would reject evolution if we found rabbits in the Precambrian fossil layer. I strongly suspect that there isn't anything that would falsify creationism in the mind of a religiously committed creationist.
Cars can be organized into a taxonomy. That doesn't mean that they evolved from a common ancestor over millions of years.
We know the mechanisms by which cars are produced, and we know the mechanisms of evolution. We know of no mechanism by which any intelligence produces life, certainly not a timeless, spaceless, disembodied intelligence. If there is a God who created life, how did he create it? Did he create humans by molding us out of dirt and blowing into our nostrils, like the Bible says? Did he carve a woman out of a rib? If so, how the hell does any of that work? We can explain mutation and natural selection to a high degree of detail down to the biochemical level. How do we explain mud men and rib ladies? helps me out on Patreon. You're a big help. Thanks so much.